Well, hi. I'm going to finish my lesson on the Soviet Union post Stalin with the leaders from 1953 to 1985, and then we'll look at the last leader of the Soviet Union, which was Mikhail Gorbachev. This also coincides with when we get into chapter 7, which is basically now. Um, we'll be covering the Cold War, but I'll do this video today and then I'll work on the Cold War videos coming up in the next couple days. So anyways, Stalin dies. And by the way, if you have Netflix, watch the movie Death of Stalin. Once again, an irreverent look at his death and the culminating power struggle of his so-called minions under him. It's kind of a comical, not exactly historical, accurate look at it, but nonetheless, it gives you kind of the gist of uh, the personalities, at least in an irreverent way, of the people under him. So, anyways, it's on Netflix. It's PG-13 or something, so there's lots of swearing and stuff like that. But once again, a pretty good movie. Um, funny in a funny way. I mean, not like ha 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 funny, but like, kind of upper level kind of funny. Okay. All right. So we're going to look at, like I said, some of these leaders. This is Nikita Khrushchev, one of his main uh, corporals under Stalin. Okay. This is Leonid Bushy Eyebrows Brezhnev. I have, um, I'll just say, kind of, I don't want to use the word fetish because that's not exactly a good word. I'm just absolutely amazed by Leonid Brezhnev's eyebrows. Okay. And as he got older, those caterpillars just got bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay. I mean, if you're leader of the one of the largest powers in the world, maybe people just didn't want to tell you, trim those things down. Who knows? So in the next coming slides, you'll notice how I have a bit of a fascination by those eyebrows. But nonetheless, I digress. So that's Nikita Khrushchev, that's Leonid Brezhnev, and I would imagine those are links to videos that you could watch about their lives. Okay, so when we think of Nikita Khrushchev following a couple years after Stalin, the key thing that comes to him, at least politically, is this concept of de-Stalinization. And all de-Stalinization is that he would actually admit that Stalin was ruthless, had done some pretty cruel things, and he was going to turn the Soviet Union at least a little bit more towards liberalism. Not let's not go crazy or not completely liberal, but um, he did usher in some reforms. Okay. He was actually deposed in the early 1960s, and Soviet Union was taken over eventually by Leonid Brezhnev. Now, Brezhnev was actually a conservative in the sense that he was more like Stalin, kind of reacted back to some Stalinistic ways of doing things. Now, nobody's ever Stalin. Stalin is kind of a one of a kind, but he did um, you know, revert back to some of the methods that Stalin had used. Okay, so in that way, he was a reactionary. Like I said, massive military buildup. One of the things that started creeping in with the Soviet Union was inefficiency, lots of corruption. I mean, one of the things that brought down the Soviet Union is if you have ever heard of the George Orwell novel Animal Farm, it seems like some of the pigs uh, were better than others. I mean, the pigs rose up and defeated the farmers, and then some of the elite pigs kind of became like the farmers and were an elite structure over the rest of the farm animals. And that's the same kind of thing that happened in the Soviet Union. There crept in, not crept in, it just became more prevalent, a lot more corruption. There was this oligarchy, this elite group that ran the country, the so-called dictatorship, the proletariat. Problem is, you put yourself in a position of power, it's pretty hard to get rid of that. And it consolidated over the time. Some people had access to vacation, some people had access to better grocery shopping, um, etc. And whereas most of the other people just didn't have it, and people started seeing through that. And like I said, I do apologize here where I say more Leo. I have a bit of a fascination with the guy that I don't know where it comes from. It might be primal. I'm just going to leave it at that, and I'll just quickly go through these pictures. Like, you think if he was a Boy Scout, he would just awarded himself with every badge available? I mean, look at all those prizes he got there. It's ridiculous. But just look at those eyebrows. I think some from time to time he did trim them up, but I think the status quo, his go-to kind of thing, was just let it go. In the words of Elsa. Now look at that. There's like a foot of. There's literally a foot of awards there. Ridiculous. All right, and that's mobster Leo right there. He looks like he's part of La Cosa Nostra. He's gonna do a hit on somebody. Anyways, enough of that. So after Brezhnev's passing in 1982, he is replaced by two other old guard um, Soviets, Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko. I coined them the Soviet fossils. They were leaders from 1983 to 1985. They didn't bring anything new. They kind of just kept up with the status quo. Um, you know, slow, uh, the corruption that was going on in the Soviet Union. They weren't going to bring in any new ideas. And like their nearly dying bodies themselves, the Soviet Union was decaying from within. Here's Andropov, and here's Chernyenko. And like I said, these guys didn't bring anything new. But because of old age, especially on the case of Chernyenko, I think Chernyenko was kind of a perma drunk. Vodka was his liquid of choice. Um, they eventually both passed away by 1985. And who came in to replace them was actually someone much younger, whereas these guys were in their 70s, and like someone in their 70s in the Soviet Union is like someone in their 90s here. Okay, I'm kind of kidding, but I'm kind of not. Okay, so eventually there was a change in the Soviet Union, and that change was spearheaded by a much younger individual. Even though you'll look at him and think he's not that much younger, because anybody over like 30 to you guys seems like they're 70, but he was only in his 50s, and that guy was Mikhail Gorbachev. Okay, when I was a teenager, people would remark on his so-called birthmark that was on his forehead that supposedly looked like California. Now, to me, that doesn't look like California. If I was going to pin it on any country, it looks like the Korean Peninsula to me, but that's just me. Anyways, Gorbachev was the general secretary of the Communist Party. Once again, he was probably general secretary, he's probably premier of the legislature, the country, might have been president, who knows, from 1985 to 1991, and was actually the last head of state of the USSR. Okay, he was there until its dissolution in 1991, which we will cover in a little bit more detail in the Cold War chapter 7. So the two main concepts you need to remember as far as Gorbachev are perestroika, which means restructuring of the Soviet political and economic system. So when I think of perestroika, it just kind of came to a point where they needed to change how things were being done economically. The old Soviet model was becoming too corrupt, not efficient whatsoever. There needed to be a changeover. So perestroika is I wouldn't say a lot like, but to me it kind of likens to somewhat what Lenin introduced with his NEP, introducing market aspects, incentive based aspects back into the Soviet economy. So there's that. Perestroika is often argued to be the cause of the eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union and the subsequent revolutions. Well, not subsequent, actually, the revolutions occurred in Eastern Europe prior to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. All right, so that's the economic change that was brought in through Gorbachev. It's perestroika. And as you can see here, there's a link to a video that you could certainly watch on that. The other main concept that came out with Gorbachev is glasnost, and that was the policy of openness. Okay, you live in a dictatorship, um, your freedom of speech is suppressed because the control of the populace is paramount to their security. And as long as you allow for some openness and some freedom and dissent, then it weakens the power structure of that said regime. Well, Gorbachev said, no, we're going to allow for more openness, we're going to allow for more dissent. But once again, if your foundation of your dictatorship is on security, on control, once you give people some freedom, they're just going to want more and more and more. And so it's kind of a semblance of any kind of dictatorial regime. You give people a sniff of freedom, a little bit of freedom, they're just going to want more. And eventually that's structured in the eventual dissolution or dissolving of this regime. All right, here is a map of the Cold War divisions. And once again, we'll get more into the Cold War in Chapter 7. The areas to the right in red and pink would be the Warsaw Pact. The areas in bluish green to the left would be NATO. And those would be democratic liberal governments loyal to, or at least allied to the United States. Whereas to the right would be the ones that were more allied and loyal to the Soviet Union. What is separating them in the middle, this red line, was known as the Iron Curtain. And like I said, I'll be covering the Iron Curtain in a little more detail in Chapter 7. Gorbachev's attempts at reform, as well as summit conferences with the then President Ronald Reagan, and his reorientation of the Soviet strategic aims contributed to, okay, so perestroika and glasnost, together with the problems that the Soviet Union had been going through with its economy, overspending on military, lack of incentive, etc., eventually contributed to the end of the Cold War, which we will cover, like I said, more in Chapter 7. It also ended the political supremacy of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, and eventually led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, I believe, Christmas Day 1991. For these efforts, he was actually awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990. Here's a picture of Gorbachev to the left signing a peace treaty with Ronald Reagan. I believe it's the START peace treaty, or it might be the IMF treaty. Okay, and this is another picture of Gorbachev and Reagan at some sort of summit conference. The thing that's kind of interesting, you look at Gorbachev is probably in his mid 50s in that picture, and Reagan is mid 70s in that picture. And just because Reagan was using Just for Men or Grecian formula, he actually doesn't look a ton older than Gorbachev, who is bald as a cue ball, and is actually 20 years plus younger. The thing that's kind of interesting is Gorbachev is actually still alive. I believe he might be in his late 80s, early 90s now, but he actually still alive. Whereas Reagan died, I think, over 10 years ago. Here is a chart showing the leadership of the Russian Empire, Soviet Union, and then Russia. Once again, you'll notice Alexander Kerensky, who was leader of the provisional government after the Tsar's abdication. No one ever remembers Alexander Kerensky. One, he did live through it, but two, because he was leader of the provisional government and eventually was taken over by the communists, no one remembers him. And then, as you can see, here's the leadership of the Soviet Union: Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev. Excuse me. That's not coronavirus, it's just a cough. Okay. You got Brezhnev, you got Andropov for a couple years, Chernenko for a year, And then, like I said, eventually Mikhail Gorbachev to 1991. Here's a little bit more of a history lesson. Once the Soviet Union dissolved into its 15 republics, the largest of those republics, of course, was Russia. Its first president was Boris, I like my vodka, Yeltsin. Okay, he ran the country from 91 until 99. He eventually was taken over for a more youthful Vladimir Putin from May 2000 to May 2008. Dmitry Medvedev ran the country for about 4 years, even though Putin was still kind of behind the scenes. I mean, really, Putin's kind of been in there ever since, you know, 1999. Like I said, Medvedev in 2012, and then Putin again, a more older, a little more sinister-looking Vladimir Putin has been the president of Russia ever since 2012.